Well, if you have your Bible with you this morning, we are going to be in the book of Judges in chapter 14. Judges chapter 14. We're going to continue our study that we began last week on the life of Samson. And we were introduced to Samson as a figure in the Bible. He is one of the judges in the book of Judges that for the last time we see mentioned in the circumstances surrounding his life that the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. And for their evil that they did, they are punished, they are judged or held accountable by God through the hand of this group of individuals called the Philistines. Remember we talked about the Philistines, the name of from which we derive modern day Palestine or Palestinian. Modern day Palestinian, though, is not the same race or ethnicity of people. Remember, the Philistines come from the islands of the Aegean Sea surrounding Greece there. And they eventually make their way up and settle in the southern part of Israel, in the territory or the land that the Israelites were never fully obedient to God in taking over. Well, it's by the hand of these people that God afflicts Israel, judges Israel, for 40 years. The book of Judges contains stories surrounding a group of individuals that are called judges. They are more than just rulers over Israel, or more than to be thought of as governors or kings, but instead they are more like military leaders who come to alleviate the suffering of the people during times in which they are under punishment. When they are under punishment or affliction for their disobedience. And so folks like Gideon, like Jephthah, like Deborah, like Samson are all in that class of people. They ruled during a time in Israel's history that the book of Judges tells us later on that there was no king in Israel in a time in which every man did what was right in his own eyes. The book of Judges is therefore largely a negative period of time in Israel's history. Things don't go very well when the people are left to themselves. Chaos reigns, idolatry infiltrates the land. The people time and time again provoke the Lord to anger. They repeatedly sin against Him, and we just see it as a dark time in Israel's history. And so there's not much good to be said during the time of the book of Judges, except for these periods in which God intervenes in Israel's history and attempts to alleviate them. We saw last time the circumstances surrounding the miraculous birth of Samson, how an angel comes and brings the news to his mother and his father Manoah, and the supernatural circumstances there, how he is to be a Nazirite who is to be set apart from the womb for that calling. We talked about the ins and outs of that calling, how he wasn't able to deal with anything that came from a vine. He wasn't to touch any type of dead carcass, and he wasn't to shave the hair of his head throughout the entire course of his life. And so those three are the primary requirements for what it meant to be a Nazirite. This was a vow that was taken typically in Israel's history for a brief period of time. We do, however, find three instances in the Bible where this is a lifelong calling. It is for Samson, who's the first. It is for Samuel, who is the second. And lastly, it is for John the Baptist as we make our way over into the New Testament. Typically, this calling, however, was just for a short period of time. But Samson had this unique calling on his life. Had these miraculous circumstances surrounding his birth. And we see lastly, where we left off last time, it said the Spirit of the Lord began to move him at times in the camp of Dan between Zorah and Eshtaol. Remember, this is when the tribe of Dan had largely still settled in the southern kingdom before the Philistines eventually run them up into the northern part of Israel. And so this is where Samson is. He's on this border between Israel and the Philistines. And we're going to see that he begins to afflict the Philistines, but not only that, to afflict his own self. In the passage we're going to look at today. If you have your Bible, we'll be in Judges chapter 14, and we're going to go through this entire chapter today. And so it's verses 1 to 20. It says, "And Samson went down to Timnath, and saw a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines. And he came up, and he told his father and his mother, and said, I have seen a woman in Timnath of the daughter of the Philistines. Now therefore, get her for me to wife. Then his father and his mother said unto him, Is there never a woman among the daughters of thy brethren, or among all my people, that thou goest to take a wife of the uncircumcised Philistines? And Samson said unto his father, Get her for me, for she pleaseth me well. But his father and his mother knew not that it was of the Lord that he sought an occasion against the Philistines. For at the time the Philistines had dominion over Israel. Then went Samson down, and his father and his mother to Timnath, and came to the vineyards of Timnath, and behold, a young lion roared against him. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and he rent him as he would have rent a kid, and he had nothing in his hand. But he told not his father or his mother what he had done. And he went down and talked with the woman, and she pleased Samson well. And after a time he returned to take her. And he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion. And behold, there was a swarm of bees and honey in the carcass of the lion. And he took thereof in his hands, and went on eating, and came to his father and mother, and he gave them, and they did eat. But he told not them that he had taken the honey out of the carcass of the lion. So his father went down unto the woman, and Samson made there a feast, for so used the young men to do. And it came to pass, when they saw him, that they brought 30 companions to be with him. And Samson said unto them, I will now put forth a riddle unto you. If you can certainly declare it me within 7 days of the feast, and find it out, then I will give you 30 sheets and 30 changes of garments. But if you cannot declare it me, then shall you give me 30 sheets and 30 changes of garments. And they said unto him, Put forth thy riddle, that we may hear it. And he said unto them, Out of the eater came forth meat, and out of the strong came forth sweetness. And they could not in 3 days expound the riddle. And it came to pass on the 7th day that they said unto Samson's wife, Entice thy husband, that he may declare unto us the riddle, lest we burn thee in thy father's house with fire. Have you called us to take that we have? Is it not so? And Samson's wife wept before him, and said, Thou dost but hate me, and lovest me not. Thou hast put forth a riddle unto the children of my people, and hast not told it me. And he said unto her, Behold, I have not told it my father nor my mother, and shall I tell it thee? And she wept before him the 7 days while their feast lasted. And it came to pass on the 7th day that he told her, because she lay sore upon him, and she told the riddle to the children of her people. And the men of the city said unto him on the 7th day, before the sun went down, What is sweeter than honey, and what is stronger than a lion? And he said unto them, If you had not plowed with my heifer, you had not found out my riddle. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he went down to Ashkelon, and slew 30 men of them, and took their spoil, and gave change of garments unto them, which expounded the riddle. And his anger was kindled, and he went up to his father's house. But Samson's wife was given to his companion, whom he had used as his friend. What a story. What a story about this man, Samson. We see the first thing that we find out about his life is that after the Spirit of the Lord began to move on him, and it says at times in the camp of Dan between Zor and Eshtaol, chapter 14 begins to expound on that, and expounds in what ways God used Samson against the Philistines. Well, what we're going to find here today regarding this man Samson is that there are some lessons to be learned. There are some things that you and I are to take and to apply to our lives as we look at the life of Samson. As extreme as this situation might be, there are some lessons for you and I to apply. I think if we had to summarize or to kind of put into as few words as possible the life of Samson, I think the words in the New Testament in the book of James, chapter 1, verse 8, help us the most. It says, A double-minded man is unstable in all of his ways. A double-minded man is unstable in all of his ways. The phrase double-minded in the Greek means literally dual-souled, a two-hearted individual, a double-minded man. This is someone who has divided interests, who is driven about by the lust of the flesh, and at the same time has a calling from the Spirit of God. This is somebody who is double-minded. A person that is double-minded, that is dual-souled, is unstable in all of its ways. I think that's what a phrase that we can use to best describe Samson this morning, especially as we look at the text before us. But I want to point out to you 4 things about Samson that demonstrate this downward spiral or this downward slide in his life. 4 things. First thing is this: he had a disrespect for authority. A disrespect for authority. It says, Samson went down to Timnath and saw a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines. And he came up and he told his father and mother about it and said, I have seen a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore go get her for me to wife. Then his father and his mother said unto him, Is there never a woman among the daughters of thy brethren or among all my people that thou goest to take a wife of the uncircumcised Philistines? And Samson said unto his father, Get her for me, for she pleaseth me well. But his father and his mother knew not that it was of the Lord that he sought an occasion against the Philistines, for at that time the Philistines had dominion over Israel. So there's a lot at work in this desire of Samson's here. First and foremost, we are told that he desires something that he shouldn't have, right? He desires something that he shouldn't have. He desires a woman of the Philistines to be his wife. God gave the nation of Israel strict rules about intermarrying with the people in the land that they would go in to possess. The reason for this was not racial or ethnic. The reason for this was cultural and religious. It's because all of the nations that the people of Israel were going in to dispossess so that they might possess the land worshipped idols. And with their idolatry came not only the worship of another god, but came all types, all forms of immorality. For instance, those in Canaan that worshiped the god Molech, they had this ritual whereby they would actually take children and cast them into a fire. And they would offer up child sacrifice. All types of immorality in all realms of life. And so God told the nation of Israel, He said, when you go in, don't take their daughters for your sons or their sons for your daughters. The reason being is because they would bring those types of lifestyles with them. They would bring that idolatry and everything that went with it with him. In Exodus 34, He gives this command for the first time. He also gives it in Deuteronomy 7. But He says, Take heed to thyself, lest thou make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land whither thou goest, lest it be for a snare in the midst of thee. But you shall destroy their altars, break their images, cut down their groves, for thou shalt worship no other God, for the Lord whose name is jealous is a jealous God. Lest thou make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they go a-whoring after their gods, and do sacrifice unto their gods, and one call thee, and thou eat of his sacrifice. And thou take of their daughters unto thy sons, and their daughters go after their gods, and make thy sons go after their gods. God gives them clear instructions. Clear instructions not to do the very thing that Samson is demanding his parents do for him. We have to understand that in this context. So when Samson comes and tells them, look, I've seen this daughter of the Philistines and I want her for my wife. Probably had something to do with her beauty. And so when he comes to his father and mother, their response is this, is there not somebody among your people, is there not an Israelite that you can take for to wife? And Samson said this, Get her for me, for she pleaseth me well. We're told it as a note, as a side note, in verse 4, that says his father and mother knew not that it was of the Lord. That doesn't mean that God put a sinful desire in Samson's heart. It doesn't mean that God made Samson to sin in this regard. What that means is this, is that God was about to use Samson's sinfulness, his own sinful desire, and what he was about to do to accomplish his purpose in Samson's life, with or without him. Warren Wiersbe says this: when God isn't permitted to rule in our lives, He overrules and He works out His will in spite of our decisions. Of course, we're losers, or we're on the losing end for rebelling against Him, but God will accomplish His purposes either with us or in spite of us. It's one of the amazing things we find about the world is that God accomplishes His purpose in spite of the sinfulness of mankind. Whether that's for you and I as believers, in spite of our shortcomings and our sinfulness, the things that we neglect, the things that we do that we shouldn't do, all those things, God takes them into account and still accomplishes His purposes in the world. In the same way, no vast amount of armies, no amount of conniving by world rulers can thwart the ultimate plans of God. Should be great comfort in that. But there's also a great warning in that we don't want to find ourselves on the wrong side of history. We don't want to stand before God one day and be on the wrong side of things. And have God demonstrate how He accomplished His purposes in our lives and in the lives of those around us in spite of us, rather than through us. Jesus said the greatest words that we can hear one day are, "Well done, good and faithful servant." And so while God still accomplishes His purposes through Samson throughout this whole scenario, we find Samson's repeated sinfulness, his repeated failure to be and to do what God had asked of him. And so he comes back to his parents and he demands something of them. He goes against their wishes and their clear godly instructions here. Ephesians 6 tells us to honor our father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well within, that thou mayest live long on the earth. Verse 4 tells us that God actually does take and use this to His own ends, because He was seeking an occasion against the Philistines. Well, what we find the end result of all this is that 30 Philistines are slain, and Samson's deliverance of Israel, or God's deliverance of Israel at the hand of the Philistines, or that alleviation, begins to take place. And so God accomplishes His purpose, but we see that Samson is still very much accountable for everything that he does in this whole scenario. I think one of the best places this is seen is in the book of Esther. Remember when things are kind of coming to a head with Esther, Mordecai, and Haman, and all that transpires there? Haman had set a trap and had tricked the king into signing into law, a law that essentially allowed the Persians to wipe out the Jewish people who were scattered throughout the empire. Esther, being a Jew who was married, happened to be married to the emperor, who happened to be married to the king Xerxes, or Ahasuerus. They're speaking to her cousin Mordecai, who practically raised her. And it says, and Esther spake unto Hathach, and gave him commandment unto Mordecai. And it says, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come unto the king into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called to come in unto the king these 30 days. Esther had a problem. She was asked to go and intervene for her people before the king. But the only way she could, even as queen, gain an audience with the king is if the king held out his golden scepter and accepted her. She couldn't just barge into the king's chambers, or else she, like anyone else who did this, would be put to death. It says, they told Mordecai Esther's words, and then Mordecai, he commanded to answer Esther, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. Mordecai says, look, Esther, you're going to suffer at some point the same fate as all your people. Don't think you're going to escape. And he says, for if thou altogether holdest thy peace at that time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from some other place. Listen to what Mordecai says to her there. He says, look, Esther, if you're not going to obey, if you're not going to do what God's put you in this position to do, he says, look, God will deliver His people some other way. He says, but thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? You know, in a book, Esther, some argued its canonicity, meaning its inclusion in the Old Testament throughout history. For a book that doesn't mention God at all. God is very much present in all that takes place. Mordecai recognizes this and says, look, Esther, if you don't do it, God will find somebody who will. He says, but who can tell if you've been put in this situation for such a time as this? What he says to us or teaches us in regards to Samson is profound here. That God is going to accomplish His purpose in spite of our disobedience. But God desires to accomplish His will in and through our lives as His people. And He calls us to be involved. He calls us to be on board. He calls us to submit, to surrender to His will in our lives, that He might do that. Not of compulsion, but willingly. What we see in Samson is a spirit of rebellion in spite of one who was immeasurably blessed and called by God. He had this disrespect for authority toward his parents that ultimately showed a disrespect for the Lord's authority over his own life. Second thing we see about his downward slide is that he had an irreverence for his calling. An irreverence for his calling. So it says, then went Samson down and his father and his mother to Timnath, and came to the vineyards of Timnath, and behold, a young lion roared against him. And the Spirit of the Lord, it came mightily on him, and he rent him as he would have rent a kid, and he had nothing in his hand, but he told not his father or his mother what he had done. And he went down, and he talked with the woman, and she pleased Samson well. It says, and after a time he returned to take her. He turned aside to see the carcass of the lion, and behold, there was a swarm of bees and honey in the carcass of the lion. And he took thereof in his hands, and went on eating, and came to his father and mother, and he gave them, and they did eat. But he told them not that he had taken the honey out of the carcass of the lion. When Samson and his parents go down to Timnath to handle the arrangements of a marriage, typically the way this would work in ancient times is a dowry would be offered on behalf of the groom for the bride to the family of the bride. That's the way it was typically done. It was much like a purchase. Of course, it involved a covenant of marriage and all of that. And so as they go down to make those arrangements, they go down to Timnath, and it says there are vineyards in Timnath. Vineyards in Timnath. The fact that his parents aren't with him when he is encountered by this lion, or when he encounters this lion and slays this lion, tells us that Samson probably goes on a detour by himself to these vineyards. And it says when he goes to these vineyards, he's deliberately walking where he's not supposed to be. The requirements for a Nazirite vow read this way in Numbers 6, verse 2. Speak unto the children of Israel, say unto them, when either a man or a woman shall separate themselves to vow a vow as a Nazirite, to separate themselves unto the Lord, he shall separate himself from wine and strong drink, and shall drink no vinegar of wine or vinegar of strong drink, neither shall he drink any liquor of grapes, nor eat moist grapes or dry. All the days of his separation shall he eat nothing that is made of the vine tree, from the kernels even to the husk. Where is he going on this day? To a vineyard. To be in a vineyard where those things are. He repeatedly puts himself in situations that inevitably will lead to sin. That's where he puts himself here. Puts himself in a vineyard. Furthermore, when he's there where he's probably not supposed to be, as a man who's forbidden to have anything to do with the vine or the fruit of it, he finds himself here, and he's confronted by this lion. It says a young lion. And as the lion comes upon him, probably aggressively, it says the Spirit of the Lord comes on him and allows him to destroy, to tear, to kill this young lion. So God gives him this supernatural strength that he's able to kill a lion, it says, with his bare hands, with no tool, with nothing in his hands. He's able to kill a lion with his bare hands, just as he would, it says, a kid, a young goat or a lamb. It's a pretty amazing feat. I mean, I'm not going to get in a cage with a tame lion, let alone one that's out in the wild, and even attempt to put my hands on it. But Samson's able to destroy it, to kill the lion. And as his family goes down, he doesn't tell them what has happened. And they go down and they make the arrangements. And while they're on their way back, he obviously ventures off by himself again because his parents do not know that the honey that he gives them comes from the carcass of the lion. While he's on his way back, he sees the carcass of the lion laying there, and he notices that either in the chest cavity or whatever, however this worked, bees have formed a swarm there, a hive there, and they have made some honey. And so what he does is he reaches into the carcass and takes the honey and begins eating it. He goes and gives some to his parents that they might eat it as well. What Samson does here, if we're not careful, we won't notice it, but he violates another requirement from his Nazirite vow. Violates a second requirement. In Numbers chapter 6, verse 6, it says, all the days that he separateth himself unto the Lord, he shall come at no dead bodies. Here he handles a dead carcass in order to get honey from these bees that have formed in the carcass of the lion. And as he goes back, it says he gives some to his parents, but doesn't tell them that he's taken the honey out of the carcass of this lion, that they still don't know that he is killed with his bare hands. What Samson demonstrates for us here is some practical application for our own lives. He had an irreverence for his calling. And the psalmist says in the very first psalm in the Bible, in Psalm 1, he says this, blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. He shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that bringeth forth his fruit in his season. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper. What the psalmist there tells us is this, is that whatever or whoever you put yourself around, you're inevitably going to be involved in. So what the psalmist says is don't allow these other things to influence you. If you're tempted by something, don't put it around you. Don't be around it. You know, the Bible tells us in the New Testament, it talks about idolatry, and it talks about fornication or sexual sin in the same way. It tells us to flee them. The way we test our spirituality is not demonstrating how strong we are at resisting something. The way we demonstrate our spirituality and our spiritual maturity in the Lord is getting away from something. Something that causes us to sin, we get away from. That's why Jesus says, if your right hand offends you, do what with it? Cut it off. If your right eye causes you to sin, he says, pluck it out. He's not speaking literally that we ought to cut our arm out or pluck our eye out. But what he's talking about is if there's something that causes you to stumble, get rid of it. Because he says you're better off to miss out on that and everything surrounding that and to enter into life, he says, maimed, talking about the hand and the eye, than to have all of your body parts and be cast into hell. Pretty profound statement. It's what Samson demonstrates. He demonstrates the negative of it. He demonstrates what it is to walk closely with what causes us to stumble, to repeatedly give in to what we know we are tempted by. Samson puts himself around all the things that he's not supposed to be around. And it's why his life and the things that he does turn out the way that they do. Paul calls us in Ephesians 4 as Christians to walk worthy of the vocation wherewith we are called, with all lowliness and meekness, long-suffering and forbearing one another in love. He calls us later on in that same chapter to put off our former conversation, the old man which is corrupt, and to be renewed in the spirit of our mind, and to put on the new man which after God is created in righteousness and true holiness. To put off those old things and to put on the new in Jesus Christ. To walk worthy of the calling. Not to irreverence the calling. See, we think of a calling as like a special calling, like to be a pastor or a missionary or something like that. When we talk about our calling in the New Testament, it primarily has to do with our Christian calling. The same calling that is placed on all of our lives. Those other callings are secondary. We are Christians before we are pastors or teachers or anything of the sort. Our calling is to first walk in obedience to God as to what it means to be a Christian. To put off the old man, to put on the new. To walk worthy of the calling that we have been given. And Samson ignores the calling that God has placed on his life as an irreverence for it. Thirdly, we see he had an uncontrolled use of his tongue. Look at verse 10. It says, "So his father went down unto the woman, and Samson made there a feast, for so used to young men to do. And it came to pass when they saw him, that they brought 30 companions to be with him. And Samson said unto them, I will now put forth a riddle unto you. If you can certainly declare it me with the 7 days of the feast and find it out, then I will give you 30 sheets and 30 changes of garments. But if you cannot declare it me, then shall you give me 30 sheets and 30 changes of garments. And they said unto him, Put forth thy riddle, that we may hear it." So here Samson demonstrates his childishness, his immaturity again, is that he not only sins against God with what he has done, but now he makes a joke of it. He poses a riddle to these 30 individuals about what he has just done. It says in verse 14, he said unto them, Out of the eater came forth meat, and out of the strong came forth sweetness, and they could not in 3 days expound the riddle. This way this wedding procession would work is the dowry would be paid, and that there would be this 7-day feast, and on the 7th day the marriage would be consummated. These 30 companions that are given to him, we're not exactly told in the text, but he doesn't have any groomsmen, so to speak, or companions or friends at the feast. And so 30 are given to him, presumably probably from the Philistines. And so these are not true friends of his. These are just 30 random individuals that are picked to take part in the wedding feast with him, to be his groomsmen, so to speak, if we have to relate it to modern times. And he gives to them a riddle. And the riddle has a wager attached to it. He says, if you can tell me the riddle, if you can solve the riddle, then I'll give you 30 sheets and 30 changes of garments, because there's 30 men there. But if they can't solve the riddle throughout the wedding feast, then they have to give the same to him. So all of this is just childish, it's immature, and it shows a complete disdain for God. And it says, It came to the pass on the 7th day that they said to Samson's wife, Entice thy husband, that he may declare unto us the riddle, lest we burn thee and thy father's house with fire. Have you called us to take that we have? Is it not so? So here's 30 men who really don't have a stake in all this, and they're about to be out 30 clothes, which would amount to a lot of money, and 30 sheets. And so they don't have the means probably to come up with this. We have to assume here that they would probably give the clothes off their backs and the sheets in their homes. That's the idea here. So it's about to cost them a great deal. And so what they do is they go to Samson's would-be wife and they threaten her and say, look, you either figure out what this riddle is and tell it to us so we don't lose out, or we're going to burn your family. We're going to burn your house down, we're going to kill your family, all that. They threaten his wife with what? With getting this answer. And so it says, Samson's wife wept before him and said, Thou dost but hate me and lovest me not. Thou hast put forth a riddle unto the children of my people, and hast not told it me. And he said unto her, Behold, I have not told it my father or my mother, and shall I tell it thee? He hadn't not only told his parents the riddle, but he hadn't told them the story about why the riddle existed in the first place, about the line and everything surrounding that, about where the honey came from. And so he tells her, he says, look, I haven't told my parents. You think I'm going to tell you? They're not even married at this point. And it says she wept before him 7 days. And while their feast lasted, and it came to pass on the 7th day that he told her, because she lay sore upon him, and she told the riddle to the children of her people. So she wore Samson down over the course of time, in the same way that we're going to see Delilah does to him later on. And he eventually gives in. It says, and the men in the city said unto him on the 7th day before the sun went down, what is sweeter than honey, and what is stronger than a lion? And he said unto them, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you had not found out my riddle. Now, while the last part of that verse might come across a little funny there, what he's saying, if you hadn't threatened my wife, you would have never figured it out. Put it in modern terms, if you hadn't cheated, you would have never figured the riddle out. She's not concerned that they threatened his wife necessarily. He's more concerned with the fact that he lost in this whole wager. We have to be careful not to miss what he does here. It's one thing to disobey God and to be contrite over it. It's another thing to disobey God and to joke about it. I think we've reached a place, and this is not primarily from the text here, but I think we've reached a place in a society where we now no longer just sin and then maybe are a little ashamed about it, but we reached a place with certain sins in our society today where we not only sin and joke about it, but we've actually taken it a step further. We sin and we're proud of it. The kind of attitude demonstrates the utmost disdain, disrespect, irreverence for God's will, for God's word, and for God's ways. Samson had an uncontrolled use of his tongue here. He made a wager that he should have never made. He spoke about something he shouldn't have been proud of. He shouldn't have joked about. He shouldn't have treated lightly. And he had an uncontrolled use of his tongue. Proverbs 10 tells us that in the multitude of words there wanteth not sin. In many words, sin is not lacking. Sometimes the most powerful thing is to say less than to say more. That's why we have in our Constitution the right to avoid self-incrimination. It's because inevitably the more we talk, the worse things get for us. It's just a general rule in life. Proverbs tells us that Samson here speaks out about something he should have never opened his mouth about. Jesus says that out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And he says that every idle word that men shall speak, we will give account of it on the day of judgment. Every idle word, every word, we'll have to give an account of. James, I think, says the most conclusive thing about the tongue in the New Testament. He says, for in many things we offend all. I mean, we sin, we fall short in many ways, but he says, if any man offend not in word, this man is a mature, a perfect man, able also to bridle the whole body. The tongue is the hardest thing in our lives to tame. He says, behold, we put bits in horses' mouths, and they obey us, and we turn about their whole body. Behold, also ships, they are very great, and they're driven by fierce winds, yet they're turned about with a very small helm, whithersoever the governor listeth. Even so the tongue is a little member, and boasteth great things. Behold, how great a matter a little fire kindleth, and the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. So is the tongue among our members. It defileth the whole body, and setteth on fire the course of nature, and it set on fire of hell. For every kind of beast, of birds, of serpents, of things in the sea is tamed, and hath been tamed of mankind. But the tongue can no man tame. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. Therewith we bless God, even the Father, and curse men, which are made after the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. And he says, my brothers, these things ought not be so. Ephesians tells us, let no corrupt communication proceed out of our mouth, but that which is good to the use of edifying, that it may minister grace unto the hearers. When we speak, the Bible says we ought to speak as of the oracles of God. When we talk, we We ought to let nothing corrupt come out of our mouth, but instead something that is beneficial to the use of edifying. That doesn't mean we walk around like Joel Osteen and we're just positive and put everything in a positive light all the time. Sometimes that means we have to correct something that's wrong. What it does mean is that when we speak rightly. We speak righteously, something that benefits someone else. Samson represents for us here fickleness, immaturity, taking something that was sinful and making a joke or a riddle out of it. And so he had an untamed tongue. The last thing we see is Samson's temper. Had this unbridled temper. It says the Spirit of the Lord came on him and he went down to Ashkelon, and it says he slew 30 men of them and took their spoil, and he gave the change of garments unto them which expounded the riddle. So here's where God gets involved with this, is he takes this whole situation and uses it as a way to get at the Philistines. That Samson actually goes and kills 30 Philistine men so that he might get the garments that he needs to supply the other men from the wedding to fill the wager. And so God actually does accomplish something through all of this, through all of Samson's disobedience, as bad as it was. But Samson, afterwards, enters into a fit of rage. A fit of rage, it says, and his anger was kindled, and he goes to his father's house. It says he went up to his father's house. And we can't miss what happens here. Samson gets so upset, not because he's out 30 garments. That was seemingly an easy task. He goes and kills 30 of the Philistines, gives them the garments. But Samson is upset because he lost the wager, because he lost the riddle. And he's so upset that this woman, that just a few moments and days prior, he desired with all his heart, so much so that he was going to cause himself and his family to disobey God's commands, to go down and marry, he no longer wants. So instead of getting married, it says Samson goes home to his father's house. I can't help but get the picture of kids playing in the backyard, one of them falling, scraping their knee, or getting cheated in a game, stomping off, screaming, I'm going home. That's exactly what Samson does here. He goes and fulfills the wager and then goes home. It says he's not even getting married anymore. We find that in verse 20. It says, but Samson's wife was given to his companion, probably one of the 30 men. This would be the equivalent of a best man whom he had used as his friend. So this woman, since the marriage and everything was already underway, had to be married to somebody. Samson's best man, this companion, gets her instead. So after all of that, Samson goes home unmarried. Wow. The Bible tells us about the danger of a temper. It says, he that is soon angry, has a short temper, dealeth foolishly, and a man of wicked devices is hated. James tells us some more. It tells us about this. It says, wherefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. Why? Because the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God. Through this, however, God is able to keep Samson from an unholy alliance, at least for this period of time, that would have hindered his later work. So God, through all of this, keeps Samson from this marriage. This is this thing that within God's sovereignty is so difficult for us, really impossible for us to fully wrap our minds around. And that's this idea of providence. Providence. God's providence is His intervening in human history. It describes everything. From Him sustaining all things, to Him working in the ordinary affairs of life to accomplish His purpose, to get us to a certain end. He doesn't cause, but He uses sinful things to bring about His purposes, just as He does in the life of Samson. that those things that we intend for evil, as with Joseph, God then intends for good. That the things that we do as a purely sinful action, God can, in His sovereignty, in His providence, take and work together for good. I think Joseph's life most embodies that as you read from Genesis 37 through 50. How his brothers sent him down to Egypt, sold him into slavery. At first wanted to kill him, but sold him into slavery into Egypt. And God, through everything that He brought Joseph through, ended up bringing Joseph to this place of second in command of pretty much the whole world, as Egypt was the dominant empire at the time. He was second in command only to Pharaoh. And all the affairs of dealing with a coming famine were entrusted to him, so that the whole world came to him from starvation. And through all that, through his brother's wicked intention, God saved the whole world from starvation and preserved His chosen family of Israel. In the same way God does here on a smaller scale. Through Samson's disobedience, his immaturity, and everything else, God uses Samson to alleviate and to deliver Israel from the hand of the Philistines in Samson's life. And it begins here with him killing these 30 men. We're going to see more next week. But God is able to keep Samson here in His providence from this unholy alliance for future work. How many of you have ever been faced with a decision, and in your mind and in your heart's desire, you desired things to turn out a certain way? You wanted things to come out a certain way, and you made decisions accordingly, and you were faced with that. And you even prayed to God and said, God, I want it to work out this way, and so on and so forth. Only for that thing not to work out that way at all, but something entirely different to work out. Maybe even the opposite. But years later, you look back on your life and you realize that if things had turned out the way that you had originally wanted, it would have probably been disastrous, or not turned out as good as things ended up turning out. That's God's providence. That even when you and I, when our desires are completely out of line with His will, that the Bible says to us as New Testament Christians that we don't even know the things that we ought to pray for half the time. But it says the Spirit helps in our weakness. It helps in our infirmity, with groanings that cannot be uttered. And the Spirit, He intercedes for us according to the will of God. So that God in His providence and His sovereignty, whatever situation you find yourself in here, He is working out according to His own will what He wants to accomplish in your lives. Whether He gives you what you want in the moment or not. It's a pretty amazing thing. Something that you and I will never be able to fully grasp our minds around. It's something that even in this life we're only at times privileged to be able to understand, to look back and to say, wow, look at what God did. But when we get to heaven, it's going to be amazing how when we look back at all that God did in our lives, how He did certain things at certain times and in certain ways to produce a certain end in our lives. We're going to look back and we're going to marvel at how powerful and how all-wise His ways were that were not our own. Having especially a young child, you kind of get a little bit of that perspective about how he wants stuff all the time that I know is not good for him. For instance, we're at home, cars go up down the street, and we're out playing in the yard, his first reaction is to run toward the road. Well, any decent parent knows that no matter how bad that child wants to go out on the road, that's not the right thing to allow that child to do. On a much bigger perspective, we're like that a lot of times with our Heavenly Father. We kick and scream and say, God, I want this to turn out this way, and we make these demands of God. We see a lot of that in Samson, and we say, God, I want this, and all the time God in heaven is like a young parent with a young child scratching his head, that would destroy you, would not be good for you. Romans 8 tells us this, one of the most profound verses and many in the Bible. It says this. It says, he that spared not his own son, but delivered him up for us all, how shall he not with him freely give us all things? Means if God didn't spare his son, then why in the world would he withhold any other good thing from his children? It means that there's a purpose behind everything. It's working all things together for good to those who love him, to those who are the called according to his purpose. And even in someone who's as disobedient as Samson, we learn that God is still on the throne. In Psalm 32 it says, I will instruct thee and teach thee in the way which thou shalt go. I will guide thee with mine eye. Be ye not as the horse or as the mule, which have no understanding, whose mouth must be held in with bit and bridle, lest they come near unto thee. I think that's a pretty powerful statement. God says, I'm going to accomplish my purpose in your life. He says, it's up to you how you want that to be done. He says, you can either be like one who has understanding. He says, I'll teach you, I'll show you the way you ought to go, and you can walk in it in obedience. He says, or you can be like the mule or the horse who has no understanding, whose mouth has to be guided by a bit. Isaiah 1 says this about the nation of Israel. Hear, O heavens, give ear, O earth, for the Lord has spoken. I have nourished and brought up children, and they have rebelled against me. He's talking about the nation of Israel, and he says this, the ox knoweth his owner, and the donkey his master's crib, but Israel doth not know, my people doth not consider. Think about that. He says animals sometimes are better off than we are when it comes to listening. That's why the 23rd Psalm is so powerful. It speaks into this. It says, the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. That means I won't lack anything. If God leads, I do not lack. There might be things I think I need that I don't have. But I never truly lack anything. Paul said, the Lord is my helper. What shall man do to me? Quoting from the Old Testament. So where does this leave us with Samson? How do we apply this to our lives today? Well, we look at how God sovereignly intervenes, yes. We also look to our own hearts, our own lives, and maybe put to the test, maybe examine ourselves as to whether or not we've truly surrendered to the will of God in our lives. Whether we're walking in obedience to Him or not. I think James, again, helps us out here in James 4. He says, adulterers and adulteresses, know ye not that friendship of the world is enmity with God? Whosoever therefore will be a friend of the world is the enemy of God. Do you think that the Scripture saith in vain, the Spirit that dwelleth in us lusteth to envy? But He gives more grace. Wherefore He saith, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit yourselves therefore to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and He will draw nigh to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be afflicted and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to heaviness. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and He shall lift you up. What James says there is this, is that today we hear His voice, we examine our hearts, and we look at the Scripture and we look at Samson's life and we see how he was disrespectful for authority. We see how he had an irreverence for his calling, how he didn't control his tongue, how he had this, he lost his temper, how all of these things, and we see similar things in our own lives, and we see the ways in which we have failed to be obedient to God in the everyday course of our life. What James says we ought to do is we ought to recognize that God gives grace. He resists the proud, but He gives grace to the humble. So what he says, therefore, is this: submit to God and resist the devil. Submit to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and He will draw near to you. It says, cleanse your hands. That's talking about your actions. Clean up your actions. And he says, and purify your hearts. Clean up your mind. Whatever divided interests you have, whatever things are preventing you from being fully obedient to the Lord, from being fully surrendered to Him, He says, get rid of it. Get rid of it. He says, be afflicted and mourn and weep, and let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to heaviness, and humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord. It says, and He will lift you up. A broken and a contrite heart, the Lord will not refuse. Hosea says, come and let us return to the Lord, for He is torn and He will heal. He hath smitten and He will bind us up. So today, if God has spoken to you, and however He has spoken into your life, I want to invite you to come as we sing this hymn of invitation here in just a short moment. As Terrence and Cecil come to lead us, I want